white oppressive forces prevents black people from developing the proper counter strategies that are necessary in order to liberate ourselves by keeping our understandings of our plight and conditions flawed. Because they know that as long as our understandings remains flawed, then all of our liberating strategies and remedies that stems from those misunderstandings will also be flawed. They don't want us ever gaining an accurate understanding of our plight and condition that are necessary in order to develop the proper counter strategies that are required in order to liberate ourselves. This is why they have millions of black people now believing that our collective condition is caused by the Willie Lynch slave syndrome. That silly myth presents what would in fact be the least effective way and least plausible scenario for controlling generations of millions of people. It's simply not how true brainwashing works. Keeping our understandings flawed is also the reason why they have so many black people believing that our plight is connected to the Bible. The belief that a Bible that was written by our most ungodliest enemies throughout history and that was brutally beaten into the blood-soaked minds of our ancestors by their ungodly enslavers somehow contained the true words of God that will now set us free is in fact an idiotic belief. Black Bible believers are clearly not critically thinking. Thorough research easily proves that the Bible and the Willie Lynch letter are both works of fiction. When black people connect our condition and our plight onto easily proven works of fiction, we are in fact making damn fools of ourselves. The worst affliction of the black oppressed is not an ignorant mind. It's actually an ignorant mind that has been fed false knowledge. Because an ignorant mind might continue to seek for the liberating truth. But an ignorant mind that has been given false knowledge, believing is true, stops searching for the truth, thus becoming mentally enslaved by the false knowledge. This is why white oppressive forces have fed so much false knowledge into the black community in regards to our plight and our condition. False knowledge are being used to mentally enslave millions of black people. They also now have many African Americans believing the false knowledge that we're not from Africa, but are instead the true indigenous people of America. However, millions of us have taken DNA analysis that have scientifically proven that we are in fact Africans. The most idiotic belief they've got millions of African Americans believing is that we made the N-word ours and that using it now ridiculously empowers us. The truth is that billions of African Americans have been socialized to self-identify ourselves as niggers through negative white media social engineering. Doing so conditions us to perceive ourselves through a false, inherent, subordinate, inferior identity that aids the white society in maintaining a social dominance over us. All of these noted beliefs are held by those among us that are ignorant. Whenever people are ignorant, they'll always believe nonsense. I will not be silent to appease black ignorance, especially when it's black ignorance that gives the white oppressors their greatest power over us. I'd rather lose black friends for telling the black liberating truth than to endorse ignorant beliefs in order to hold on to ignorant, mentally enslaved black friends. Our core problem is that the ignorant and mentally enslaved ones are totally ignorant of their own ignorance and mental enslavement. And they fight fiercely against those of us who try to educate them and free their minds. Nonetheless, those who know the truth must teach, and a speaker of truth has no friends. African Proverbs. Here's the truth of our plighted condition. The African American culture has fundamentally changed from what it was during the 1960s. It has in fact changed 180 degrees. Case, point, and proof. During the 1960s, African Americans implemented the most successful unified protest in U.S. history. It still remains unrivaled by any other group in U.S. history. Today, to the contrary, African Americans are now more divided than at any previous time in history. During the 1960s, we agreed almost unanimously that white oppressive forces are our worst enemies. Today, to the contrary, millions of us are now insisting that it's ourselves that are now our worst enemies. During the 1960s, we call ourselves brothers and sisters, and we call our oppressors crackers. Today, we are calling ourselves niggers and bitches, and we call them white people. Thus, respecting them more and respecting ourselves much lesser. During the 1960s, we were proud of our African heritage. We wore afros, and many of us gave ourselves African names. Today, many of us are ashamed of our African heritage, and now wears European weaves and would rather be called a nigger than an African. Millions of African Americans also now reveres, respect, and admires Caucasians in spite of a brutally horrific history proving that Caucasians have never, ever earned our reverence, our respect, nor our admiration. The African American culture has fundamentally changed 180 degrees from what it was during the 1960s. And here's a social science fact. A culture never changes 180 degrees on its own. It's always by deliberate design whenever this happens. Furthermore, these noted changes clearly benefits the white society. It's always by deliberate design whenever the culture of the oppressed changes in ways benefiting the oppressors. White social engineering scientists deliberately socially engineered the African American culture in ways that serves and protect the U.S. system of white supremacy by deploying an ideological subversion system against the entire African American population. Social engineering is a term which has been used to mean top-down efforts to influence particular attitudes and social behaviors on a large scale, most often undertaken by governments, in order to produce desired characteristics within a targeted population. Ideological subversion is an offensive psychological warfare tool that uses disinformation, misinformation, and repetitive media subliminal manipulation to manipulate targeted populations to think and behave in ways that are against their own self-interest and instead in ways serving the interests of those deploying the ideological subversion system. The purpose is to attack the targeted population in a bid to destabilize and undermine the entire ideological structure. In regards to we African Americans, the goal is to spread so much disinformation into the black communities until virtually everything believed by the black population are lies that hinders our liberation. It confuses the black population to such an extent that no one is able to come to any sensible conclusion in the interest of liberating ourselves from white oppression. The history and reason. During the 1960s, the 1960s was the most turbulent decade within the United States history. While America's blatant racism treatment of African Americans had resulted in unprecedented unified black protests. African Americans' unified protest still remains unrivaled by any other group in U.S. history. African Americans confronted the U.S. system of white supremacy on all fronts. It was confronted through civil disobedience tactics, militant means, nonviolent protests, and with black lawyers pleading for equality within America's highest Supreme Courts. Those strategies resulted in the enactment of many civil rights laws that improved the lives of all minorities. While all ethnic groups possess the ability to bring about real change within the United States, only African Americans have produced such changes. African Americans had unknowingly proven themselves as being the greatest threat against the U.S. system of white supremacy. So much, in fact, that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover said the unification of the American Negro was the greatest threat against the nation. It was decided that something had to be done. To remedy what was then called the Negro problem, in 1967, President Lyndon Johnson put together a committee called the Kerner Commission. Their assignment was to study the Negro problem, find the cause of the problem, and then develop solutions. In 1968, white social scientists hired by the Kerner Commission determined the following reasons were the core aggravating factors for that decade's unprecedented unified black protests. They determined that a significant cause for that decade's unprecedented unified black protests was blatant white racism. It was largely decided that it was time to abandon those blatantly white racist segregation tactics that were used in the past against the African American population. It had become necessary to develop more covert methods for subjugating African Americans that are not as easily recognized nor easily comprehended by their black victims. White racism always prevails best when its black victims no longer recognizes it. They also determined that an aggravating core factor for that decade's unprecedented unified black protests was caused by an elevated and unifying black collective self-esteem brought on by the emergence of the Black Pride movement. They therefore now keep our collective self-esteems very low by constantly inundating us with fraudulent, black, racially demoralizing propaganda. They literally subject us to only receiving the fraudulent worst narratives about ourselves. Those white social scientists also determined that many African Americans had developed an allegiance towards Africa that impeded the growth of our patriotism towards the United States government. It was largely determined that the African Americans' allegiance toward Africa had to be eroded. They determined that it could be eroded by turning Africa into a source of shame and humiliation for African Americans. To achieve this feat, white propaganda designers constantly subjects African Americans to seeing only those images of a war-torn, famine-ridden, rapidly literate, and disease-stricken Africa. By only showing the poorest parts of Africa, it conveys a subliminal message that African Americans, we were fortunate that our ancestors were enslaved. The constant embarrassment also erodes millions of our allegiance towards Africa and literally makes many of us feel grateful that slavery happened because it's now perceived that it ultimately benefited us by rescuing us from the backwoodsness of Africa. This propaganda campaign also prevents millions of African Americans from pursuing the reparation debt that the U.S. government still owes us. Those white social scientists also learned from studying the African American culture that whenever people are oppressed for long durations, their collective aggressions against their oppressors will continue to grow until it reaches a boiling point, resulting in massive acts of rebellion against their oppressors. The oppressed always eventually rebels against their oppressors. This is an inherent response within the collective human psyche whenever people are being oppressed for long durations. This is what was actually happening among the African American population during the 1960s. White racism had reached a boiling point within the collective minds of the African American population, which resulted in that decade's unprecedented unified black protests. Those white social scientists largely determined that they could subdue unified black protests. They could prevent it from happening by shifting black people's collective aggressions away from the white society and redirecting it towards ourselves. They achieved this feat also by keeping us believing the fraudulent words about ourselves. More specifically, they exaggerate the issue of black on black crime, which conveys a subliminal message that it's ourselves that are now our worst enemies. And it's also designed to make us fear each other. The white ruling power realized that a fearful black population is much more easier to control than a fearless one. Fear is one of the most powerful emotions, and it can be used as a tool for controlling targeted populations. When people are gripped by fear of a threat, people's rationality shuts down, making them easily manipulable by anyone that promises safety from the threat. Oppressive governments often maintain their grip over a targeted group by continually invoking fear and then proceeding to claim that only they, the ruling powers, have the means and ability to protect the population from the threat. The white, the white society manipulated black people to fear our own people and to believe that we need the white society to protect us from our own people. Fear within a targeted population are often consequences of narratives created by those in positions of power. Ruling classes for many years have understood the power of intentionally invoking fear in their subordinate populations as a means of social control. Social scientists calls it fear psychosis. Manipulating black people to think in ways benefiting the white society is not a new concept. Throughout history, those empires that were brutally oppressive, fearing eventual retribution from those they brutally oppressed, have always manipulated the minds of the oppressed to think in ways that prevents us from unifying and seeking retribution against our oppressors. Therefore, the beliefs and perceptions held by the oppressed are never truly theirs. They are always falsehoods beneficial to the oppressors that were shrewdly embedded into the collective minds of the oppressed by their oppressors without the oppressed even realizing it. This is our hidden reality. We have to elevate our minds above biblical fairy tales and silly myths. We have to function based upon what is true. Because if our understanding remains flawed, then all of our remedies will remain flawed. This is why those of us who know the truth must teach. It is time to wake up to our reality and function based on what is true. One love and peace.